This is an ABC News special report. The confirmation hearing of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning and welcome to our special coverage of the most consequential and dramatic congressional hearing of our time. President Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, and one of his accusers, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, both set to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Right now, Dirksen Senate Office Building, the hearing room of the Senate Judiciary Committee, set to get underway at 10 a.m. Senator Charles Grassley, the chairman, will gavel things to order. David Muir on Capitol Hill, World News Tonight anchor. And David, this is a personal moment for the two witnesses. It is a political moment for the country, a huge cultural moment as well.
No question, George, and I have to say, under a gray sky here in Washington, it's been raining here off and on this morning, and we know millions of Americans will have their eyes trained on both Brett Kavanaugh in that small hearing room and on Christine Blasey Ford, who really they have never seen before, George, except for those still photos. We do understand she is up here, she's in the building, and so is someone else that the American people will meet right here this morning, George. Her name is Rachel Mitchell. She's the veteran sex crimes prosecutor out of Arizona, retained by the Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Republicans, 11 of them, they are all men. They wanted to avoid asking questions, and so it'll be Rachel Mitchell who will ask the questions for them of both Christine Blasey Ford and of Brett Kavanaugh. We do know that right up here on Capitol Hill last night, we're seeing pictures of her here this morning. Last night she was meeting with Republicans at Chuck Grassley's office, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. That meeting lasting about an hour, and when they emerged, a couple of the senators talking about how it was a good meeting. They didn't really discuss the questioning, but they did talk about procedures, saying she's not familiar with it. And it was interesting, Orrin Hatch, who emerged from that meeting, we know he was here 27 years ago for the questioning of Anita Hill. He said, I think it's better for us to have a third party do this because no one can accuse us of insensitivity, if you will. We do know that Christine Blasey Ford and her team had pressed for several days that these Republican senators have to ask the questions themselves, but instead today it will be Rachel Mitchell. And we should point out, George, that the Democrats on that committee, they will be doing the questioning themselves of both Kavanaugh and of Christine Blasey Ford.
And there we see one of them, Patrick Leahy, right there, the senior Democrat. Our team on Capitol Hill, David Muir and Mary Bruce, are there. That's what it looks like on TV from up here in New York. David, how about the room?
You know, George, I have to say it is unmistakable here how clunky it is, the transition between the Republicans on this committee to the Democrats. You've talked about Rachel Mitchell there, who's been brought in by the Republicans so that they would not have to question Dr. Christine Blasey Ford or Brett Kavanaugh when he appears before us here later today. But that transition back and forth has been bumpy, if you will. But what has not been bumpy is sort of the temperature and tone in that room from the woman who is answering the questions, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Obviously up to the American people at home to make up their own minds about the veracity of what she's saying. But she has been very consistent, George. She said, I am here not because I want to be, I am terrified. She said the details of that night I will never forget, as she choked up reading her opening statement. And then in the questioning that followed, she said, could this be a case of mistaken identity? No was her answer. Is it possible you mix them up? No was her answer. She was just asked by Senator Durbin about the possibility of this being mistaken identity. She said to this question, what degree of certainty was this Brett Kavanaugh? Her answer, 100%. And I have to say, George, as Americans, and this has become so political, obviously, these allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, as they decide whether or not they believe what they hear today, there is the other major issue in this country in this era of Me Too. In that moment with Senator Patrick Leahy looked at her and said there are millions of people across this country who are victims of sexual abuse, sexual assault, for whom you have become a hero up here today. They respect you for coming forward with nothing to gain. And George, you could see her as she picked up that cup of coffee that she had asked for. She was visibly moved. That was the first moment in the room when her efforts were applauded for representing people around this country whose voices haven't been heard.
Yeah, that is one of the... David Muir, you've also heard some reaction from Senator Grassley's office?
Yeah, Chairman Chuck Grassley himself, in fact, George, in leaving the room was asked, do you find her credible? He actually told reporters, we need to take her very seriously, were his words. Later, he told our own John Parkinson that they will need to sleep on all of this. That was his reaction coming out. The faces of some of the other Republicans leaving the room for this short break, solemn, rather stone-faced. And you have to wonder, George, about some of the other Republicans on this committee. I know they made a calculation to bring in Rachel Mitchell out of Arizona to do do the questioning for them, so there wouldn't be a repeat of Anita Hill 27 years ago. But many of the senators, although some were here, many of them were not here. Ben Sasse, Jeff Flake, and we've seen the photographs from Trish Turner, our reporter in the room, where they're leaning forward in their seats, their hands to their faces, intently listening to Christine Blasey Ford, and this calculation that they wouldn't ask the questions themselves in this moment to show that they too have sensitivity and compassion and do want to hear from this witness. And when you hear from Chuck Grassley, who now says himself, we need to sleep on this, we need to take this woman seriously, I wonder if there will be, looking back at this, discussion of a miscalculation and not allowing some of these senators to show that they do understand this moment we're in.
And if he's, but I want to bring this first to David Muir. It's been interesting, David, to watch this as they continue with the strategy of having Rachel Mitchell ask their questions.
Yeah, no question, George. They sit silently, but, you know, they speak volumes with their facial expressions. We have a reporter in the room, Trish Turner, and she's been snapping still photographs that she's been sending our way. And I wanted to show you one that we captured right there. You can see Jeff Flake, his hand to his face. To the right of him, of course, Ben Sasse there, who at times leans forward in his chair. They are really hanging on every word being offered by Christine Blasey Ford. And George, you and I talked about this a little earlier in the proceedings about whether or not Republicans will look back at this moment and perhaps debate whether or not it was a miscalculation to at least not allow some of these Republican senators to ask questions and to signal to their constituents around the country and millions of people watching this that they too understand the depth of this moment. There's something else that's emerged in this second batch of questioning, and that is what Christine Blasey Ford doesn't remember, and particularly the Democrats on this committee are trying to make a point that's okay, that you can't poke holes in what she doesn't remember. And in fact, she was asked about this notion, in America, from some who will say boys will be boys. And she actually made the point, Christine Blasey Ford, in her answer to say, I was 15 years old at the time, and sometimes when you have these memories, they carry even greater weight when you're younger and you don't have the maturity, the faculty to actually handle the depth of what's been done to you, that sometimes those memories are deeper. And again, that plays right into the fact that she's a psychologist and the areas of study as an adult. And there was one moment just a moment ago, and it was meant to be a political point made by Senator Blumenthal in talking about something that Lindsey Graham on the other side of the aisle had written himself about prosecuting rape cases, talking about the courage for victims to come forward in the depths of their own memories. And Senator Blumenthal, in addressing the Republicans on the other side of the aisle, saying if we can agree on nothing else, we can agree on the courage for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford to come forward. And you could see it in her face, George. This was one of about a handful of moments, 3 or 4 moments, where she looks like she is about to, perhaps tear up.
She did visibly,
very visibly.
She did visibly tear up. And I want to bring this to David Muir, the need to hear from other witnesses in the case. And David, if that's the case, there's no way there can be a vote tomorrow morning.
Well, it would seem that way, George, and it certainly flies in the face of this argument against any sort of FBI investigation, which obviously is not going to be signed off on by the White House. But certainly a vote tomorrow is what Republicans had been pushing for, including Lindsey Graham, who for days now has said we need to move this forward. But just to add to what you just reported there, George, Lindsey Graham went on to say, that there are people who will say others saw this. Someone must have taken her from that home that night. Can they help fill in the gaps? We need to hear this to do the best you can. And he said, if the trauma did happen on that day, that's an important event for me to know more about from the people who might have witnessed it, which again plays right into the argument that we've heard from the Democrats on the committee today. We need to hear from others, most pointedly, Mark Judge, who they brought up repeatedly during the course of this hearing today.
John Carl, up until those statements, so from that room in that Senate Judiciary Committee right now, only 3 members there. The chairman, Senator Grassley, the ranking Republican, Senator Hatch, and Senator Leahy, the ranking Democrat, who were actually on the committee during the Anita Hill hearings.
And as you mentioned, George, still ahead in these hearings are the folks who perhaps have 2020 dreams of at least running for the presidency. I'm also struck by the number of senators up here on the Hill who are watching in their offices. equally as close as the senators obviously in that room. There's been so much attention paid to the Democrats up for re-election in states that Donald Trump won handily in red states. But the focus has really turned as this week has worn on, and particularly with the testimony today, to these Republicans, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. There were protests outside her office all this week. The pressure is mounting for them. Jeff Flake, who said just a short time ago that he is still listening to her every word, has not made up his mind. And George, we saw that quote from Lisa Murkowski earlier this week, and I thought it said it all about where her head was at going into today's hearing. She said, "We are in a place where it's not about whether or not Judge Kavanaugh is qualified. It's about whether or not, as a woman who has been a victim at some point in her life, will be believed." And that was a thought that she delivered heading into this hearing.
And so, David Muir, and that might be one of the most difficult questions, David, that Judge Kavanaugh is going to have to answer today. And you see the Democrats previewing it already. Sir, isn't it in your best interest to ask for an FBI investigation now so that if you are confirmed to the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, you can do so without any taint?
Yeah, and you saw Senator Kamala Harris pushing that point, trying to make the point that Dr. Blasey Ford has been so willing on multiple fronts, including the polygraph, and saying she would ask for an FBI investigation, be willing to sit down for an interview with the FBI, that she's been willing to do all of that, but that Kavanaugh has not. And so, George, I do think that's going to be the line of questioning that we'll witness here a short time from now. No sign of Judge Brett Kavanaugh here at the Capitol yet. We do know that his parents are in the building. But you've all talked about the political battle lines which have now been drawn. They are stark in that moment that Lindsey Graham came outside that hearing room. And it was quite something, though, to witness him saying, after hearing a couple of hours from this woman from California who came in and bravely, even as the chair, Senator Grassley said, very bravely shared her story, that he would come out and say that he was the one who felt ambushed. He said that he believed that she was as much a victim as Brett Kavanaugh, that she's a nice lady who came forward with uncorroborated claims. Of course, he was pressed right in the hallways here at the Capitol. Why then was there no FBI background check? And he turned right back to Feinstein and the timing of that letter. But I think the bigger picture here is which party is going to sense the temperature of this wave that you and Terry have mentioned here. Will it be Lindsey Graham, who then points back to the timing of the release of this letter and this information? Or will it be Kamala Harris, who looked at that woman, that mother who sat before us today, her two kids, her husband back in California, having had to move from location to location with security now? She called her a profile in courage. How did America see this woman this morning versus how they are seeing here, where the political battle lines are being drawn as we're on the air today? And
in about half an hour, we're going to hear from Brett Kavanaugh. He's going to have his chance with an opening statement. Question. David Muir there on Capitol Hill right now. You've now seen two examples of people who clearly believe every word of everything they were saying in their testimony today, and now it's incumbent on the committee to decide who they believe.
Absolutely, George. And for as much analysis as there was this morning for several hours on the emotion displayed by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, she admitted herself that she was terrified to be here. At times, she was moved by the words being offered to her, mostly by the Democratic senators, obviously, because the prosecutor who's been retained by Republicans to ask the questions, that she was moved by what they would say to her. In the very same way we're already seeing on Twitter and across social media almost immediately is sort of an analysis of his emotion as he came into that room. His prepared statement, which he said had only been read by, I believe, someone who clerked for him, as he read through that speech, he would flip the pages with anger, visible anger, for having been here multiple days after these allegations first surfaced. He said he would have been here that very next day. He asked for it. They did not allow that to take place, in his words. There's also an analysis of the tears, obviously, very emotional, as he talked about, as you just pointed out, George, his daughter Liza, who suggested that during a family prayer that they pray for the lady too. And as he has been sitting there before that Senate Judiciary Committee, George, just over, obviously, his right shoulder to our left, watching his wife sitting there, her bottom lip oftentimes trying to contain the emotion as she sits there and listens to her husband defend himself. You can see the image right there. 2 rows behind her are the attorneys for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. We had learned that Dr. Ford is not watching this part of the hearing, but that her attorneys would be in the room. They have sat there. We've been reading their facial expressions as well, though mostly contained on their part. And that moment when Senator Feinstein asked about an FBI investigation, why didn't you ask for that? He said, I'm here today. I'm answering your questions. I'll do whatever the committee wants. But almost immediately on Twitter, there were many asking, why didn't he, if he's so angry about these allegations, why did he not demand today an FBI investigation?
Yeah, he was not. David Muir, how's it playing in the room?
Yeah, well, leaving the room for this last break, Senator Joni Ernst, Republican of Iowa, of course, she was seen patting him on the back as they walked out of that hearing room. So it appeared to be some support from Senator Ernst as they left the room. But Terry's absolutely right. We are watching a political battle play out. He is fighting. He's campaigning to hold on to this nomination. We first saw that with the sit-down interview, obviously, with Fox News and his wife. That is something we had not seen before. And this anger today is a nominee trying to hold on to this nomination. Make no mistake about it. He did try to, as George mentioned just there, Senator Klobuchar, he did appeal to her about their previous conversations and told her that he appreciated her respect for this process, but she still pushed through and tried to ask him about, Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas, and the fact that President George H.W. Bush asked for the FBI background check to be reopened and asked, is that not reasonable? He didn't want to answer that question. And again, it's the battle lines that have been drawn, just as we've been watching this afternoon. Senator Durham asking him a very similar question about why not just ask for an FBI background check right now. And there was that moment of silence you saw there. He said, you don't want to answer the question? And he said, I'm here right now answering the questions.
David Muir, now that we've seen John Cornyn and Lindsey Graham speak up for the Republicans, do we expect all the remaining Republican senators to ask the questions?
Well, I mean, I think they're heading in that direction, and Cornyn was just asked about that. The senator said, I think that Kavanaugh has done a good job of defending himself, but then he was pressed in the hallways here of the Capitol. Why did you decide to take over questioning from Ms. Mitchell? And he said, quote, because it's my right as a United States senator. But as we watch Senator Lindsey Graham there say this is the most unethical sham he's witnessed in all of his years up on the Hill. It's not a job interview. This is hell, he said. He said if you were Bill Cosby back in high school, that it's his understanding that you would continue to be Bill Cosby today. And as you point out, that's a message being heard across town at the White House with the president watching. But along with the political party, the battle lines being drawn here between the Democrats and the Republicans, who went first, who went second, will there be an FBI investigation, will there not be one? The other glaring difference in the second round of these hearings this afternoon are those Republican men in that committee feeling much freer in questioning Judge Kavanaugh than they did with Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, and that is something people are picking up on. They are now engaging in that in social media. Why are they so willing to engage with Judge Kavanaugh when they, outsourced, if you will, their questioning of Dr. Ford? And
we will see if it continues. David Muir, we have not seen a day like this in years.
Yeah, if ever, in a Supreme Court showdown, as you know, George. And the dividing line that you speak of across the country as millions watch this play out today could be seen in very stark terms right inside that hearing room. When Judge Kavanaugh sat at that table, we heard the Republican senators, in particular Lindsey Graham, who said that this is not a job interview, this is hell. And he went on to defend Judge Kavanaugh right there as the hearing room watched. That was followed up by several other Republican senators who, by the way, did not conduct the questioning for the first part of the day, the hearing with Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And during that part of the hearing, George, very different. Many of the Democratic senators turning to Dr. Ford and one calling her a profile in courage. You could see Christine Ford become very emotional as those words were offered to her as she sat there in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Another senator calling her heroic. Across this country tonight, people are left to decide the veracity of Dr. Christine Ford, who we heard and saw for the first time today, and then Judge Kavanaugh, who no one can argue fiercely defended himself. He was angry, at times very emotional, choking back tears several times as he defended himself with a statement he said he wrote himself and showed only to one other person. And George, I just learned this tonight, that Senate Republicans, the conference, will hold a post-hearing meeting to take the temperature of all of the senators, as we know, not only the senators inside that Judiciary Committee, but those who were watching closely, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, George.
That is likely to happen in hours. I know you're going to go do world news for much of the country. They'll see that at 7 o'clock.